Cannabis Fund. Primary focus, investment stage, geographic focus, current TCF platform of the Conscious Fund. Co-founding partner of the Conscious Fund from the United Kingdom, Henri Sant-Cassia.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to talk to you today about some investment topics and also introduce you to the work of our venture capital fund. Before I go into detail, I'd like to kind of take you back in time. If you think back to 2012, 2013, the very early days of Canadian cannabis, what you saw for investors was the chance to participate in what were perceived as very high risk, very early stage companies, the Tilrays, the Auroras, the giants of a few years later. What we've seen from a fund perspective within the cannabis industry is that since that date, it's become increasingly difficult to get the kind of large returns that investors love to find. The market has become very crowded. There are now thousands of cannabis companies of all descriptions. The public markets became very volatile. And as an investment fund, looking at this category over the last 3 years, we began to become slightly jaded with the standard transactions that we were seeing within cannabis. We did see good opportunities, predominantly in Asia, which is one of the reasons why I got to know the people at CISW. We've looked at India, China, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and there were opportunities there. We also found some interesting opportunities in later stage, more mature companies in California and states like that. What we weren't seeing was the type of opportunities that you would have found in 2012, 2013. This led us to look for a subsector within cannabis with greater growth potential. And the subsector that we focused on is psychedelic medicine. This uses psychedelic compounds to tackle 3 key health and wellness issues: mental health, chronic pain, and addiction. And when we looked at this sector, we discovered that it had some very interesting parallels to 2012, 2013. A lot of companies that had been working off the radar, quietly getting their research and their initial work together, began creating an industry and a true subsector about 12 months ago. Psychedelic medicine is similar to cannabis in the sense that it uses psychoactive compounds to affect positive change in the brain and the body. Cannabis is much broader. There are lots of physical medicines that can be derived from cannabis. With psychedelic medicine, we're talking only about the brain and the central nervous system. So there are really 3 sectors: mental health, addiction, and pain. And between these 3 sectors, you're looking at a potential patient population in the billions. In fact, some of the projections for the size of this subsector actually peg it as being larger than the cannabis sector overall by 10 times. Banks like Credit Suisse have analysed this space, some very big institutions, and some of the numbers around market size are frighteningly large, in the $1 trillion range. So our work really is to find the winners of tomorrow, back them early, help them to grow and scale. In some cases, these companies will go public. So if you think back to Tilray, Aurora, there are parallels within the psychedelic medicine subsector. In fact, the first company, Compass Pathways, has just gone public and rocketed to a $1.5 billion valuation on the NASDAQ. And there have been a whole tranche of IPOs and RTOs over the last few months. Cybin is one of the companies that we backed early. That went public a couple of days ago, and has increased in value from $10 million to around 125 within a 6-month period. So there's some real explosive growth opportunities within the psychedelic subsector. It's also a much more serious sector in that it is only medicine, there is no recreational component, and the science and complexity of these companies that are typically in drug discovery and clinic operations is very, very high. So there are some very large barriers to entry, which for a lot of investors de-risks their capital and allows them to back companies without the risk that competitors will start proliferating. The other connection between cannabis and this subsector is that a lot of the people that were high-level players in cannabis, Bruce Linton is probably the most famous example, have turned to psychedelics as a way of diversifying their work and also getting involved in something that really is very cutting edge. So you are seeing quite a bit of crossover, both in terms of the investors and also the people that are founding and scaling companies. Our approach with psychedelic medicine is very much like cannabis venture funds. We're looking for a diversified selection of companies, a good balance in the portfolio. The sector is global, very much like cannabis, so we are geography agnostic. The key thing probably that we're looking for with companies is very strong teams. If there's one lesson to be learned from cannabis, it's that the strength of the teams is what makes the biggest difference to their future success. That is far more important than the underlying business models. A strong team, a very strong CEO will often outperform companies with slicker or better developed models. We're also looking to mitigate risks. Many of the investors involved in cannabis have had quite a turbulent last few years. Some bets have come off very well, others have become mired with lack of revenue, regulatory issues, excessive competition. And I think the key lesson from cannabis is that when we as a professional fund and other investors put money down on a project, it's very important to assess how the risks can be mitigated and how investors can help to mitigate those risks by providing strategic advantages, helping them to tackle challenges, and using connections and insights to enable businesses to grow. We're also looking for a very clear vision. When we look at cannabis transactions, things like vertically integrated businesses, what we've seen as a fund is approaches that are too complicated to work. And from that, we've taken that simple, clear approaches are far better. If you are going to cultivate something, just cultivate it. Do not start adding on lots of extra bells and whistles, because that becomes a very high management overhead to look after. So clarity is very important to us. And the final key thing that we do is we focus on early stage ventures. Psychedelic medicine is, as I said, equivalent to very early cannabis. And the advantage there is you can get in early, you can buy in very cheaply, and your upside when the company exits, either through an IPO, an RTO, or an acquisition, is much, much higher. So we're targeting the kind of 20x, 50x returns that you saw in early cannabis. Just to have a quick look at the reason why the psychedelic subsector is so important. It's that in a very similar way to, for example, Dravet syndrome, childhood epilepsy, when it comes to cannabinoids, the psychedelic compounds are able to have an extremely dramatic effect on people's and patients' outcomes. So if you look at traditional treatments, pharmaceutical treatments for things like mental health and addiction, they have roughly 20 to 30% efficacy. It takes a few months for the treatment to take effect, and the majority of people will either not get better or become treatment resistant. So at the moment, patient outcomes are pretty poor. And if you think about famous cases like Billy Caldwell in the cannabinoid sector, that was very similar to childhood epilepsy. A lot of these children were simply not getting better. They had very poor lifestyles because of the number of seizures that they experienced on a daily basis. And there was nothing pharmaceutical to address the problem. Psychedelic medicine is very similar. With mental health and addiction and pain, the efficacy rate is closer to 70 or 80%. The drugs take effect near instantaneously. They have very few side effects, and they're able to take effect for a very long time. So in certain cases, a single dose could have a positive effect for 9 months, 12 months, or even longer. So for patients that aren't getting positive outcomes, the psychedelic subsector offers them a real chance of a game-changing outcome. So moving on to some of the subdivisions within the market. One is drug discovery, which is the development of new treatments, new medicines. The second one is providing treatment centres, clinics, addiction programs, things like that. The third one is technology platforms, which help with drug discovery acceleration. They may help to match patients with doctors. The fourth one, that's very similar to cannabis, is consumer packaged goods. So there is a functional mushroom market. And the fifth is ancillary and adjacent treatments, which involve businesses like media and support systems for the psychedelic industry. So there are 5 key subsectors within the market, and as a fund, we address all of them with equal weight, and we're looking to balance a portfolio across those 5 subsectors. We're a very active fund in terms of both investment and also incubation. We've incubated Hive, which is a non-North American clinics network. We set up the first industry jobs board. We helped to set up the Psychedelic Medicine Association. And we also incubated Microdose, which is the leading media brand within the industry. So we're a fund with 2 arms. We like to make investments in early stage companies, and where there's a gap in the market, we will incubate and accelerate companies to fill a void within the space. It is a very early sector, and that allows a venture fund to be active in incubation. So just touching very quickly on the science and the amount of academic clout in the industry. This is something that is being investigated very seriously by some of the top institutions in the world. Harvard is involved very heavily, Imperial College in London. Johns Hopkins is probably the leading university for psychedelic research. And there are universities globally, from Maastricht to Berlin, Toronto University, Macquarie in Australia, that are all providing very high-level research to prove, as in cannabis, what has been known for thousands of years, which is that these treatments are extremely effective. There's also some very interesting clinical trial work going on. In fact, the first drug has already come to market. That is a drug called Spravato, provided by Johnson & Johnson. It's a ketamine-based nasal antidepressant spray. And that's passed a full phase 3 clinical trial and is already on the market. Equally, there are 3 or 4 companies and organizations like MAPS, Compass Pathways, Atai, and Usona that are heading towards the completion of a phase 3 trial. So there are drugs imminently coming to market, and we're confident that there will be a patient population in the tens of millions within a year or two within the sector. So this is not a speculative industry, it's backed by heavy science, and the model has already been proven through clinical trials. Interestingly, the American government has recognized just how effective psychedelic medicine is and has fast-tracked through a program called Breakthrough Therapy 2 psychedelic compounds, which means that clinical trials may take a couple of years less time before completion. And that is a reflection of how seriously the American government sees psychedelic medicine, and also a reflection of how much unmet patient need there is within the market. So this is something that's backed by universities, backed by governments, and is only going to continue to grow. As a fund, we look at this in a very detailed, granular way. Psychedelic medicine is complicated. To contrast that with some cannabis companies, which are brand orientated, marketing orientated, very retail focused. This is medicine. It requires an awful lot of technical, legal, scientific, and medical analysis. And this is probably not a market for individual retail investors or amateur investors. It's very much a professionals market, and you're starting to see a large number of venture funds, institutions, larger family offices becoming involved with it, because you need quite a large infrastructure to find and analyze these deals before making an investment. So as a fund, we pride ourselves on the scientific, legal and other backing that we've got within the fund and our external advisors. We're a global fund. We have partners based in Europe, in the UK, the US, Canada, and in fact, venture partners all over the world, including Hong Kong, Australia, South America, and virtually every continent except Antarctica. So a very diversified, geographically spread out team. This is, as with cannabis, a very global industry. We're also an ethical fund. We recycle 5% of our profits to good causes, and 5% are recycled to portfolio companies. Psychedelics is a very ethical space. It's attracting ethical and impact investors. Many of the CEOs have programs similar to ours where profits are redistributed, and there is a real feeling of community, collaboration and ethics throughout the industry. It hasn't yet become cutthroat, and we're very proud to be involved with it. Currently, we are in the middle of raising a $60 million fund to do seed to Series A investment. We're also developing some other financial instruments. We have 7 investments already, and we're looking to talk to sophisticated investors and introduce them to this market and some of the opportunities that are out there and that will develop over time. So I'd like to thank CSIW for letting me speak today. I'm more than happy to take questions either now or via email or over the internet. We'd love to talk to anybody that's got an interest within this fascinating space as we see it unfold over the next 3 to 5 years. So thank you very much. And if there are audience questions, I'm not sure how to manage this, but I presume CSIW will send them to me in the couple of minutes that we've got left here.
Thank you so much for your presentation and all that useful information. We're curious about the psilocybins and microdosing medical implications and how you see that proliferating both domestically and internationally compared to or along the lines with medical cannabis and CBD? Do you think that they're both going to help each other in regards to becoming legalized and medically available, or do you think the psychoactive psilocybin will be faster than the medical cannabis industry?
They are a little bit different. So the real underlying difference is that these compounds are much stronger than cannabinoids. Psilocybin, which is a relatively weak psychedelic compared to, say, dimethyltryptamine or the more exotic ones, they are a lot stronger. What you will probably see is combined therapies. So, for example, if you've got chronic anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, you might go for twice annual psilocybin sessions where you're given a psilocybin-derived drug. It's got a very strong effect on you. And then you might use something like CBD or cannabis as an ongoing kind of daily routine to manage anxiety or the milder symptoms.
Sure.
So I think they'll work in parallel.
Might be more psychoactive, correct? I think they've been proven to help with PTSD and stuff, for example, correct?
Oh yes, they've got very magic mushrooms, which, you know, they've been around for centuries. In fact, they're quite well featured in Thai culture. They're featured in ancient Russian culture. They're a global kind of psychoactive plant, very similar to cannabis in terms of its history. And it's got very general applications: depression, anxiety, PTSD. There are lots of therapies that will come from these compounds in a very similar way to, you know, you found with cannabis that as people started to research it more and more, they started to find numerous conditions, whether they were physical or mental, that would benefit from cannabis therapies.
Sure.
What is happening is that the psychedelics are probably going to come into the market faster because they've been given this exemption from normal clinical trials. And that's due to how potent they are.
And they also haven't been stigmatized as much, correct?
I think cannabis did a lot of very good work with plant medicine because the stigma had already been taken out of cannabis. Thank you very much.
Additional information. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.